Rob Reiner didn't leave his children a single dollar. Not a token, not a safety net. Nearly $200 million vanished from the family overnight. And what happened next fractured one of Hollywood's most respected legacies forever. The shock didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It arrived quietly, folded into a legal envelope, delivered weeks after the cameras had gone home and the condolences had stopped. Rob Reiner was gone, but the real rupture inside his family didn't begin at the funeral. It began when the will was finally read. Inside that room, time seemed to stall. Roy and Jake Reiner listened as the numbers were spoken out loud, not as inheritances, not as family distributions, but as totals earmarked for something else entirely. Nearly $200 million. Decades of work, influence, and carefully built success. And none of it was theirs. Not a single dollar had been left to the children. No trust, no contingency, no quiet exception hidden between legal clauses. Everything had been directed toward charitable foundations. For a moment, no one spoke. Grief, which had already settled deep and heavy, shifted into something colder and sharper. This wasn't confusion. The language was precise. The intention unmistakable. Rob Reiner, one of Hollywood's most celebrated filmmakers and outspoken advocates for justice, had made a decision that instantly redrew the boundaries of his own family story. To the outside world, it would eventually sound noble, even inspiring. But inside that room, it landed like erasure. Jake sat frozen, staring at the documents, rereading the same lines as if repetition might change their meaning. Roy's hands trembled slightly as she tried to steady her breathing. This wasn't about expectations of luxury. It was about belonging. About whether they had been part of their parents' final vision at all. Within hours, the questions began forming, sharp and unavoidable. Had this always been the plan? Had their parents decided long ago that the world mattered more than their own children? Or had something changed near the end, something no one had been told? The absence of explanation hurt almost as much as the decision itself. There were no letters attached, no recorded messages, no final conversation to soften the blow. Just signatures, dates, and the cold certainty of intent. Grief doesn't follow a straight line, and in that moment, it twisted hard into disbelief and then into anger. Word of the will didn't reach the public immediately, but the tension inside the family escalated fast. Lawyers were contacted quietly, not out of greed, but out of shock. Jake, according to sources close to the family, felt blindsided, as if the ground beneath his entire understanding of family loyalty had collapsed. He reportedly said it felt like being written out of his own history. Roy, more reserved, struggled to reconcile the generosity her parents were famous for with the silence they had left behind. The will wasn't just a legal document. It felt like a verdict on who mattered in the end. As the days passed, the pressure intensified. Questions multiplied. Why leave nothing at all? Why not even a symbolic amount? The absence became louder than any donation ever could. Behind closed doors, the siblings began reviewing timelines, remembering conversations, replaying moments that now felt charged with new meaning. Had there been hints they missed? Warnings they ignored? Or was this a belief so deeply held by Rob that he assumed they would simply understand? Outside the family, no one knew yet. But inside, something fundamental had cracked. Then came the first sighting that signaled this wasn't going to stay private for long. Just days after the will's implications began circulating among legal circles, cameras captured Roy and Jake entering a Beverly Hills law firm known for handling elite Hollywood inheritance disputes. They wore dark clothing, sunglasses pulled low, faces drawn tight with exhaustion. They said nothing, not a word, but the images spoke loudly. The silence only made the questions louder. Why lawyers so soon? Why now? The will hadn't even been formally opened in court, yet the machinery was already moving. This was the moment the story shifted. What began as a private reckoning inside a grieving family started inching toward public scrutiny. And hovering over everything was one unsettling realization. Whatever Rob Reiner believed, he was teaching his children through this decision. They never got the chance to ask him why. The will had spoken for him, and its message would soon force everyone to confront a far more complicated question. Was this an act of principle, or the first crack in a legacy that no amount of generosity could protect? The mourning period didn't fade into quiet reflection. It collapsed under pressure. What should have been weeks of private grief turned into something far more volatile the moment the legal reality of the will set in. Inside the Reiner family, emotions didn't move slowly. They collided. Shock hardened into disbelief, disbelief into resentment, and resentment into a resolve that surprised even those closest to them. Roy and Jake weren't reacting to money alone. They were reacting to the sudden feeling that their place in their parents' lives had been reduced to a footnote. Nearly 2 weeks after the devastating events of December 14, 2025, the family was finally able to say goodbye, but only after the Los Angeles coroner completed all required examinations. By December 19th, official records listed Jake Reiner as the informant on both death certificates and the individual entrusted with receiving the ashes. Rob and Michelle Reiner were cremated, their remains handled quietly through Mount Sinai Mortuary, a respected Jewish funeral home in the Hollywood Hills. The service followed tradition, swift and private, with no cameras and no public ceremony. A small circle of loved ones gathered, united in grief but already fractured beneath the surface. The ashes were brought to Jake's home. There was no final resting place yet, no decision on whether they would be scattered or placed in a family plot. That last act remained suspended, unresolved, mirroring the emotional state of the family itself. Sources say those days were heavy and surreal. Conversations were short. Silence filled the spaces where answers should have been. And behind closed doors, the reality of the will loomed over everything like a shadow that refused to lift. It was during this fragile window that the legal questions turned personal. Roy reportedly struggled to process how generosity, a value her parents had instilled so deeply, could now feel so distant. Jake reacted differently. According to people familiar with the situation, his grief sharpened into anger. Not rage aimed outward, but something more dangerous, anger mixed with hurt. He reportedly said it felt as though their parents had chosen to leave a message for the world and none for their children. That sense of abandonment cut deeper than any financial loss ever could. When Roy and Jake were seen entering the Beverly Hills law firm days later, the images moved fast. Photographers crowded the entrance, voices overlapping, questions fired without pause. Who would control the estate? Had the will been validated? Were the children planning to challenge it? Roy remained silent, her expression distant and drained. Jake walked slightly ahead, positioning himself between her and the cameras, shielding her without a word. It was an unspoken signal. Protection first, explanations later. Inside that law firm, the tone shifted from disbelief to confrontation. Sources say the siblings demanded clarity, searching for something, anything, that might explain why they had been completely excluded. Roy reportedly broke down, saying simply, "This isn't fair." Jake was more direct, allegedly saying their parents had cared for the world but forgotten their own family. These weren't statements meant for the press. They were raw expressions of grief spoken in private rooms, far from public judgment. Attorneys warned them immediately. Challenging a will structured around charitable foundations would not be easy. It would be long. It would be public. And it would come with consequences. Going after charities tied so closely to Rob and Michelle's public image could trigger backlash that would permanently alter how their parents were remembered. But by that point, the siblings weren't weighing public perception. They were confronting a void left by silence. Jake reportedly responded without hesitation. They had already lost everything that mattered to them. The legal team began mapping options. Timelines were reviewed. Trust structures analyzed. Clauses examined line by line. Every decision Rob had made near the end of his life was scrutinized for context, intent, and emotional state. The question was no longer whether the will was legal. It was whether it truly reflected the family dynamic as it existed. And that question carried weight far beyond a courtroom. As the strategy took shape, one reality became unavoidable. This was no longer just a legal dispute. It was a collision between grief and principle, between a father's lifelong beliefs and the children left behind to interpret them. Outside, the world still spoke of Rob Reiner as a symbol of compassion and justice. Inside the family, those same values were now the source of fracture. And just as the siblings prepared to push back, new information surfaced that would complicate everything even further. Because what Rob Reiner believed about inheritance wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, and it had been years in the making.
The whole process for me, I can just speak for myself, it did make me understand him a lot more, and I think it made me a better father. Hopefully it did.
The more the legal team dug, the clearer one thing became. This wasn't a last-minute decision shaped by illness or confusion. Rob Reiner's choice had been deliberate, methodical, and rooted in a belief he had carried quietly for years. To understand the will, they had to understand the philosophy behind it. And that philosophy, once revealed, would only deepen the divide between intention and impact. According to longtime friends, Rob often spoke about independence with a conviction that rarely wavered. He believed deeply that children should ultimately stand on their own, not because wealth was immoral, but because he feared inherited comfort could slowly dull ambition and purpose. In private conversations, he would say that struggle, effort, and consequence were essential teachers. Too much protection, in his view, risked stealing those lessons away. This wasn't something he preached publicly. It was something he lived by quietly, shaping decisions long before the final documents were signed. That belief wasn't applied equally, and that distinction mattered. Rob saw his children differently, not as a group, but as individuals. With Nick, who had faced personal and emotional challenges over the years, Rob reportedly worried that long-term financial security could do more harm than good. One close friend described his concern bluntly, saying Rob feared that a large inheritance might become a crutch, delaying growth rather than encouraging it. In his mind, support without boundaries wasn't compassion. It was avoidance. Jake and Roy, however, were viewed through a different lens. Rob respected the lives they had built independently. Jake had established a steady career and carved out an identity separate from his father's shadow. Roy was deeply immersed in her creative work, building something of her own step by step. Rob would often joke with friends that his kids were stronger than people assumed. To him, that strength meant they didn't need a financial safety net to define their worth or secure their futures. What Rob didn't fully anticipate was how silence would distort that message. He believed his philosophy spoke for itself. Friends say he assumed his children understood his values because he had lived them consistently. But assumptions don't replace conversations, and beliefs don't soften grief. The absence of explanation turned principle into pain. What Rob viewed as an act of trust in his children's resilience felt, to them, like abandonment. Long before his passing, Rob made his intentions unmistakably clear in action. Nearly his entire estimated $200 million fortune was directed toward charitable foundations he and Michelle had supported for decades. Education, healthcare, early childhood development, civil rights. These weren't abstract causes. They were deeply personal missions tied to work the couple had built together over a lifetime. Money, in Rob's mind, was meant to keep working long after he was gone. Sources close to the family say Rob personally assigned Roy the responsibility of selling the Brentwood home and other properties, with every dollar directed straight into those foundations. This wasn't impulsive. It was organized, intentional, and legally reinforced. One family friend later recalled a conversation that now feels almost prophetic. Rob had said, "Parents aren't here to build the road for their kids. They're here to teach them how to walk on their own." At the time, it sounded philosophical. Now, it felt final. From Rob's perspective, this was love expressed through trust. He believed his children would move forward with purpose, unburdened by expectation or dependency. But grief doesn't process philosophy cleanly. For Jake and Roy, the message landed differently. It wasn't about standing on their own. They already were. It was about never being invited into the reasoning behind a decision that reshaped their family forever. As this belief surfaced publicly, it complicated the narrative. This wasn't a story of neglect or malice. It was a story of values colliding with emotion. The same principles that fueled Rob Reiner's lifelong advocacy were now at the center of his family's unraveling. Independence, accountability, self-reliance. These ideals had inspired millions. But inside the Reiner household, they became the spark that ignited resistance. And as the siblings absorbed the full weight of that belief, one truth became impossible to ignore. Challenging the will meant challenging not just a legal structure, but the very philosophy their father had lived by. The fight ahead wouldn't just determine who controlled the estate. It would redefine what Rob Reiner's legacy actually meant to the world and to the family he left behind.
No, there's so much funny stuff that happens in rehab, and a lot of funny people. Like, it's tragic and all, but the people that are there are not going to want you to throw them a pity party. They're going to want you to laugh at the situation and make light of it.
By the time the strategy solidified, there was no turning back. What began as disbelief had hardened into determination. Roy and Jake weren't just contesting documents anymore. They were challenging a narrative that had already begun forming in the public imagination. Inside the Beverly Hills law offices, the tone was no longer emotional. It was surgical. Every step forward carried consequences that extended far beyond court filings. Their legal team made one thing clear early on. This wouldn't be a quiet inheritance adjustment. Challenging charitable foundations tied so closely to Rob and Michelle Reiner's public identities would ignite scrutiny from every direction. Advocacy groups, political allies, and longtime supporters would see this as an attack on something larger than family. But from the siblings' perspective, the legacy had already been turned into something unrecognizable. Silence had made the decision feel absolute, and absolute decisions invite resistance. The core argument took shape quickly. This wasn't about undermining charity itself. It was about whether Rob's final choices truly reflected his emotional state and family relationships at the end of his life. Attorneys began searching for anything that could suggest internal conflict, pressure, or incomplete intention. Private journals, personal emails, old notes, conversations with close friends, anything that could reveal doubt or nuance. One attorney reportedly told them bluntly, "This isn't just about money. It's about redefining what your father's legacy actually represents." Behind closed doors, the siblings' resolve sharpened. Roy, usually measured and reserved, reportedly made her position unmistakably clear. She didn't want a symbolic share or a compromise. She wanted recognition. She wanted her place in the story restored. Jake was even more direct. He reportedly said public opinion wasn't his family, and reputation wasn't a substitute for love. Those words captured the emotional center of the conflict. This wasn't a legal calculation. It was grief demanding to be heard. As preparations continued, the risks multiplied. Any public challenge would inevitably pull Rob Reiner's name into headlines framed around conflict rather than compassion. The very causes he had spent decades supporting could become collateral damage. The legal team warned them repeatedly. The backlash could be brutal. It could permanently alter how their parents were remembered. But by then, the siblings had crossed an emotional threshold. From their perspective, the legacy had already excluded them. They weren't breaking something sacred. They were trying to reclaim it. Outside the family, the world continued to celebrate Rob as a symbol of integrity and justice. Inside, those same ideals now felt weaponized by absence. Friends described the atmosphere as heavy and surreal. A family torn between honoring belief and confronting hurt. The will had become more than a legal instrument. It had turned into a mirror reflecting everything left unsaid. As filings were prepared and strategies refined, one reality loomed over everything. No court ruling could answer the question that mattered most. Why hadn't Rob explained his decision to his children? Why leave them to interpret silence at the most vulnerable moment of their lives? That absence would shape the fight more than any clause or statute ever could. And as the legal battle edged closer to public view, it became clear this wasn't a simple inheritance dispute. It was a reckoning. One that would force everyone watching to confront the uncomfortable truth that even the most principled legacies can fracture the people closest to them.
Then I think it's a very sad day, because we know that racism hasn't gone away. It's there. But this man has given voice to it. And so we're going to find very carefully how many people really have those feelings.
In the end, this story isn't about greed or generosity. It's about distance. Rob Reiner devoted his life to building a better world, believing that purpose mattered more than possession. His wealth was never meant to be an endpoint. It was a tool. And in that belief, he stayed consistent to the very end. But consistency doesn't guarantee understanding, especially when love goes unexplained. For Roy and Jake, the absence wasn't financial. It was emotional. The will didn't just distribute money. It delivered a message they were never prepared to receive, without context, without conversation, and without closure. What Rob may have intended as trust felt, in grief, like exclusion. And that disconnect now sits at the heart of a conflict that no verdict can truly resolve. This case forces a difficult question into the open. Can a legacy meant to uplift the world still wound the people closest to it? And if so, where does responsibility truly lie? In intention or in impact? As the legal process unfolds, the answers remain uncertain. What is clear is that not every generous act feels kind when viewed from inside the family it leaves behind. Some legacies build bridges. Others reveal fractures that were always there, waiting quietly beneath the surface. If this story made you think, subscribe for more deep dive investigations into the stories Hollywood never fully explains.